Hello, and it's time for Chapter 20 key questions. Number one, how did the North and South react to the fight at Fort Sumter? So the fight began because the South tried to take federal territory in its own states after seceding, and under Lincoln, the Union claimed that the South did not own that territory and that the United States planned to keep it. So when Lincoln attempts to resupply Fort Sumter, one of those federal pieces of territory in South Carolina, South Carolina views this as an aggressive act, and they decide to fire upon Fort Sumter and take it by force. When this occurs, Lincoln reacts by calling for 75,000 volunteers. That volunteer list is quickly filled up, and the military is prepared for a conflict. His call for an army causes other southern states to break away. Among them among them is Tennessee and Virginia. So those states break away. The North prepares for war, and we have the Civil War on our hands. Number two, how did Lincoln ensure that border states remained in the Union? So for those that were close to the South, including Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, those states had to be kept in the Union by force, and Lincoln used martial law and troops to make sure that those states didn't break away. So by putting military occupation in those states, they really had no choice but to stay in the Union. What about Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana? Well, those states were not big on abolition, so Lincoln had to make sure that he walked a tight line between calling for the end of slavery and supporting just the idea of free soil. Had he claimed that he was supporting the end of slavery, it's possible that states like Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, and even the other border states, would have joined the Confederacy. Number three, identify the key Southern advantages and disadvantages leading into the war. Their advantages were that they only had to fight a defensive war. All they needed was a draw and to take a lot of time and to wear down the North's desire to take them over by force, and they could win the war. They also had great leaders, military officers like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and many, many others. The big thing for the South, however, is their disadvantages. Their disadvantages was that they did not have much infrastructure. They did not have many railways or roads or anything connecting their states and together to transport their troops and supplies. Speaking of supplies, their second major weakness is that they did not have manufacturing. They had very little manufacturing in their states. And that means that as time passed, they would fall far behind in supplying their troops and being able to fight war. And then finally, the population of the North far outweighed that of the South. And throughout the war, we saw a chart in class that had, by 1863, the number of Union soldiers typically doubled that of the Confederacy. So those disadvantages were too much to overcome for the South. Number four, what kept the British from openly supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War? First, we talked about how Lincoln balanced the tense relationship throughout the war. He is able to negotiate with them many times to keep them happy. But the biggest reason is because the British people would not have supported the Confederacy. They would have been quite upset if their government defended a nation that really had split away just to protect the institution of slavery. So that's what really kept the British from openly supporting them. Number five, describe an example of Lincoln exceeding his constitutional authority during the Civil War. Well, let's see. First of all, martial law is typically seen as excessive authority. He gives out loans to private citizens so they can help finance and support the war. He calls for volunteers without congressional approval. He creates military without their approval. He shuts down habeas corpus so that people don't have the right to defend themselves, or they can be arrested without a trial or even without the presentation of evidence. They can be put in prison. So there were a lot of ways that Lincoln exceeded his constitutional authority. Looking forward to chapter 21, we talk about Clement Vallandigham, a man who was outspoken against the war and the draft, and how he was expelled from the nation and charged with treason. That also is an example of the government and Lincoln exceeding their constitutional authority. Number six, why was the draft disliked in both the North and South? Well, for the North, you have people who are poor fighting the war because those who had money could purchase a substitute. And that was actually the same in the South. Specifically, who benefited from it, again, was the rich. In the South, you have plantation owners. If you own more than 20 slaves, you're actually exempt from fighting in the war. So who fought against it? In the North, you have the Irishmen. Irishmen lead the New York City draft riot. Their idea being, why should we have to fight a war that we don't support? Why should we, the poor working individuals of the North, have to fight a war that we have no part in? Unfortunately, in that New York City draft riot, they even attack African Americans because they blame them, because in their mind, the war was to end slavery and to defend African Americans. So primarily the Irish fought against it. And on both sides, you also have some leaders fight against the draft as a whole. But the North saw far more opposition, and to my knowledge, is the only one with violent opposition. Number 7, how well did each side handle the economic stress created by the war? Both sides were impacted by it. The North handled it much better, however. That's because they were able to raise taxes. They created a higher tariff. They created a federal income tax. They created a banking system that was able to handle the creation of currency and the overall finances of the war. So as far as handling it financially, they did a lot better job of developing ways of bringing in money. They also had the idea of bonds that they sold to people and bankers who would end up benefiting from it. One last thing on the North as far as handling the economic stress, because they have the manufacturers and businessmen and also even some farmers, there is some economic success for private citizens throughout the war that we see continue throughout the rest of the 1800s. Specifically, the first wave of millionaires is created by this war. So next you have the South. How did they handle it? Not very well. Having a government created in the same spirit and ideas of the Articles of Confederation led the South to struggle mightily. They have 9,000% inflation. Again, that means that if you had $1 at the beginning of the war, to the same purchasing power at the end of the war would be $9,000. And with that idea in mind, that tells you alone that they did not handle it very well. And there's a lot of factors to this. The fact that they couldn't collect taxes very effectively, did not have a centralized bank, had a weak government who could not enforce it, and also they have a blockade stopping them from selling and trading. And so, of course, their economy struggled mightily throughout the war. Number 8, what 2 factors ultimately led to the downfall of the Confederacy? We talked about a lot of factors throughout this PowerPoint and even in class, but if we have to limit it to just 2, the 2 biggest factors would be population. The fact that they were vastly outnumbered by the North and that those numbers were constantly reinforced. Combine that with the fact that a lot of Southerners couldn't fight, as in the slave population who lived down there. Combine that with the fact the Emancipation Proclamation took soldiers back home to defend their home from the runaway slaves or potential upheaval there. That helped lead to the downfall. And the second, and to me the largest, is the fact that the Union had manufacturing, the South did not. Being able to replenish your supplies, being able to get troops where they needed when they needed to be there, because you had the manufacturing and things available, that just overwhelms the chances the South had of winning. So that is it for our Chapter 20 key questions. If you have any further questions or comments, please share them with me, and we'll address all of them. Have a great day.